Hey everybody, today we're building a free digital forensics practice lab. No installs you have to pay for, no experience required. This whole lab is basically going to be one investigation broken into several stages. We'll start with raw network traffic, figure out what looks suspicious, and then check that theory against other evidence as we go. Now, that last part is the real skill here, okay? Finding something suspicious is only the beginning. The hard part is knowing whether the rest of the evidence is going to agree with you. So, when it does, your case always gets stronger. But when it doesn't, you always have to rethink. That back and forth between finding something and checking it is basically the entire foundation of the lab. So, let me break down what this is actually going to look like. Now, in forensics, the process of comparing evidence across different sources is called correlation. It's how you move from a suspicion to a supported conclusion. You almost never get a single clue that answers everything. Instead, you'll get a lot of pieces. A packet capture basically tells you what happened on the network. A log file summarizes that same event but in a different format. The host telemetry tells you what was running on the machine during that window. None of them are complete by themselves, but when you line them up and the same pattern keeps appearing, your conclusion becomes much harder to argue with. That is what we're practicing today. You're going to form a theory from the packet capture, then test it against the logs, then test it again against the host evidence. Each stage either supports or challenges what you found before. By the end, the goal is not to just identify suspicious activity, it is to explain how you know and what still needs to be checked. But before any of that can happen, we need to set up the lab so nothing slows us down once the analysis starts. We're going to do that by creating a single folder on your desktop and placing all of the lab files inside of it. I know this sounds minor, but it matters more than you might expect. When files are scattered across your system, you stop thinking about the evidence and start wasting energy on just trying to find things. In a real investigation, that kind of friction can lead to mistakes. There's also kind of a professional reason for this, because forensic methodology emphasizes preservation and organization before analysis even begins. You have to control the environment first, then you can start making sense of what happened inside of it. Now, with the folder ready and the files in one place, there's one more important thing that we kind of have to go over, which is the right tool. Now, that tool is Wireshark. Basically, it reads packet captures and lets you inspect network traffic on one packet at a time. What makes packet data special compared to logs is resolution. Logs are summaries. They tell you that something happened. Packets show you the actual exchange. You can see who initiated the conversation, what protocols they used, how the other side responded, and when exactly each message was sent. That level of detail is what makes Wireshark the starting point for most network investigations. It gives you the raw material that everything else gets compared against. If this is your first time using Wireshark, do not worry about learning every feature. For this lab, you just need to open a file, read a few columns, and start recognizing when something repeats more than it should. You will get to all of that after the setup. There's just one more optional install that I want to kind of talk about before we begin. Now, Python is not required for this lab. Everything we are going to do here is manual and visual. However, I included it because the manual process we're going to go through is the foundation for automation. Once you start to know what to look for and why it matters, Python can give you a way to ask for that same information, but faster. You can parse logs, count connections, flag repeated destinations, or measure the intervals between packets. But that only works if you understand the reasoning first. Automation without understanding, as I always say, just moves you to the wrong answer quicker. So think of Python as a future tool, not as a current one. The investigation itself starts now. So you're going to open Wireshark, load the capture file from your lab folder, and wait for the packet list to appear. This is the moment where most beginners will start to feel overwhelmed because 100 rows or 50 rows are going to show up. Every packet is going to have a timestamp, a source, a destination, a protocol, a length, and an info summary. It's going to look like too much information to make sense of. Now, that feeling is normal and it is actually a useful signal. It means you're looking at real, unfiltered evidence. Nothing has been cleaned up or summarized for you yet. Your job right now is not to understand every line, it's just to get oriented. Start scanning columns. Which IP addresses keep appearing? Which protocols show up most often? Does anything seem to repeat? Now, you're not analyzing anything yet, you're just getting familiar with the landscape, okay? To do that well, you need to understand how the Wireshark window itself is laid out, because the information you need lives in three different places. Now, Wireshark splits the screen into three panes, as I mentioned before, and each one shows you the same packet but at different levels of detail. The top pane is the packet list. That is your broad view. Every row is one packet, and the columns give you the quick summary: source, destination, protocol, timing. This is where you scroll, scan, and start to notice patterns. The middle pane is the packet details. When you click a row in the list, this pane breaks that single packet into its protocol layers. Ethernet at the bottom, IP above that, then the transport layer, then whatever the application protocol is. This is where you go when something in the list kind of catches your attention and you want to look closer. Now, that bottom pane is the raw bytes. That is the actual content of the packet in its lowest form. You will not need it much in this lab, but knowing it exists kind of helps you understand that Wireshark is showing you everything, just at different levels of detail depending on what pane you're looking at. The key habit to build is moving between the list and the details. You're going to notice something broadly, then you're going to drop down and inspect one packet closely. Then you'll go back up and keep scanning. That rhythm basically carries throughout the entire lab. Now, here is where the approach might feel backward. You're not going to filter anything yet. Before you narrow anything down, you kind of need to get a sense of what ordinary looks like in this capture. Scroll through the packet list. Don't type anything in the filter bar, just look. Notice what protocols dominate. Notice which conversations seem routine. Notice what feels like background noise. This step exists because suspicious activity doesn't really announce itself. In real environments, callback traffic hides among normal web requests. So brute force attempts blend in with the legitimate login activity. If you don't have a sense of the baseline, you basically have no way to tell what's actually standing out. So what you're going to do is write down one thing that looks normal, one thing that seems to repeat, and one thing you want to come back to later. That list does not need to be long, it just needs to exist, because once you start filtering, your view of the capture is going to change completely. You want a memory of what the full picture looked like before you started cutting it down. So now that you have a feel for the environment, filtering gives you a way to test what caught your eye. What you're going to do is enter the first filter shown on the screen and press enter. The packet list is going to change immediately. Now, what you're going to be seeing is only DNS traffic. You're going to clear that filter, enter the second one. Now you're only seeing outbound web requests. Notice what happened. The evidence didn't change, your view of it changed. That is all a display filter does. It controls what shows up on the screen, the full capture is still underneath, and you can always go back to it. Now, starting broad like this is useful because it lets you see one category of traffic at a time without committing to anything too specific. You can scan for patterns more easily when the noise is reduced. But protocol filters only tell you what kind of traffic exists. They don't tell you who is responsible for it. To answer that, we need to shift from filtering by protocol to filtering by host. What you're going to do for that is clear the filter bar and enter the first IP filter shown on the screen. Now, every packet involving that one host is visible and everything else is hidden. This changes what kind of questions you can ask. Instead of asking what kind of traffic exists in the capture, you're now asking, what is this one machine doing? Where does it send traffic? How often? Does it keep going back to the same place? Does it stay inside the network or does it just reach outward? Do this for each of the three hosts listed on the screen. Each one has a different story. One shows a pattern of repeated outbound contact, another shows pressure against an internal service, a third shows signs of file transfer activity. Those are three scenarios for this lab. Each one is a different kind of suspicious behavior. And your job in each one is not to jump to a label, it's to look at the evidence carefully and decide what it actually supports. Now, filter to the first host and look at the destination column. One outside IP address will keep showing up over and over. That repetition is the first thing to notice, but repetition alone is not suspicious. Plenty of normal services generate repeated traffic. What makes this different is the shape of it. Check the timing between those connections. Is it consistent? Are there gaps roughly the same length? Are the packet sizes similar each time? When an internal host contacts the same outside system at steady intervals with similar packet sizes, that pattern is called beaconing. In a real compromise, beaconing is how malware checks in with a command in control server. The host reaches out on a rhythm and asks for new instructions, waiting for that next interval. That regularity is what separates it from normal browsing, which is messy and random by nature. Now, we are not concluding that this is malware. We are just noting what the pattern looks like and how it's more than like a automated callback to a usual web activity. You're going to write down the source, the destination, the protocol, and the timing. That is your first theory. Now, keep that in mind because the next scenario shows a completely different kind of suspicious behavior. And seeing both side by side is what starts building your sense of how threats look at a network level. What you'll do in this scenario here is clear the previous filter and enter the port filter shown on the screen. Now you're only seeing traffic aimed at remote desktop on the port 3389. RDP is one of the most commonly targeted services in real attacks. It runs on a well-known port. It is often exposed to the internet by mistake, and if the credentials are weak, a brute force attack can succeed quickly. That's what makes it high value target for pretty much anyone trying to gain initial access to a network. Now what you're going to do is look up what shows in the capture. One source is sending a burst of connections attempts to one target, all in the same port. Count the attempts, look at the timing, notice how concentrated the activity is. Here is the important part. The packets show you that repeated connection attempts happened. They do not show you whether any of those attempts succeeded. Network evidence can prove that someone tried, but what it can't prove is that someone got in. That is why your wording matters. Write this up as consistent with suspected brute force activity, not with this proves the system was compromised. So now we have two theories. One host that looks like it might be beaconing outward, one host looks like it might be targeting from the outside. Different directions, different behaviors. But the third scenario is the one that changes the stakes because it moves from communication to actual data transfer. What you're going to do, clear the filter again and enter the FTP filter shown on the screen. Now you are basically looking at file transfer traffic. Up to this point, the activity we found involved communication. One host checking in with an outside server, another host being hammered with login attempts. Both are worth investigating, but neither one directly involves data leaving the network. This is different. FTP is a transfer protocol, and unlike more modern options, FTP sends most of its commands in a readable form. Look at the packet details and check for the FTP commands listed on the screen. If you see a store command paired with a file name, that is the host telling an outside server to accept an upload. The login commands before it tell you what credentials were used for the session. That is not proof that sensitive data was stolen. It's proof that a transfer was initiated. What was in the file, whether it mattered, and whether it completed are all separate questions. But visible upload commands from an internal host to an outside destination is strong evidence of outbound transfer activity. So, write down the internal source, the outside destination, the protocol, and any file names or commands you can see. That is your third theory. Now, step back and look at what the packet capture gave us. Three distinct behaviors, okay? A possible beacon, a targeted service attack, and an outbound file transfer. All of that came from one evidence source. The natural question is whether any of it holds up when we check it against something else. And that is exactly where we go next. You're going to close Wireshark for a moment and open the CSV file from your lab folder. This is the first real test of your theories. The CSV contains a structured summary of network events. Each row is one event, and the columns match what you saw in Wireshark. Timestamp, source, destination, protocol, port, byte count, and a detailed summary. They are listed on the screen if you need a reference. Now, your job is going to be pretty straightforward with this. Go through the three scenarios one at a time and see whether the patterns show up there. Can you find the repeated outbound requests from scenario A? Can you find the bursts of RDP attempts from scenario B? Can you find the FTP upload activity from scenario C? If the same host, ports, and timing appear in the CSV that you already saw in the packets, that is two separate sources agreeing with each other. Your theories are not just based on one view anymore. They are supported by independent evidence. But once agreement is it's starting, it's not finished, okay? It's still starting. The next file gives us a third chance to check and feel very comfortable in our theories. What you're going to do is open the ndjson file in a text editor. Each line is basically one event stored as a single record. It's going to cover the same activity that we just saw again. Same time window, same events, but the format is going to be completely different from the CSV. There's no columns or row. Each event is basically a self-contained record with labeled fields. I included both formats on purpose because format flexibility is part of the skill. In a real investigation, you will rarely get evidence in one consistent layout. Firewall logs look different from web server logs. Endpoint exports look different from raw packet data. If you can only read evidence when it looks like a spreadsheet, you are going to struggle when the format changes. Work through the same three scenarios here. Look for the same source hosts, destinations, ports, and timing. If the pattern holds across the packet capture, the CSV, and now this file, you have three independent sources that agree. The network side of your theory is solid, and that raises the next question. Everything we have checked so far shows what happened on the network. None of it tells us what is happening on the machine itself during that same time window. To answer that, we need a completely different kind of evidence. Basically, what you'll do is open the sysmin file from your lab folder. This is host telemetry. It shows what processes ran, what connections they made, and what files were created on the system. This is a fundamentally different view from everything we've looked at so far. The packet capture and the logs we watched the network from on the outside, the sysmin basically watched the machine from the inside. There are three event types to focus on here. Event ID 1 logs when a process was created, it captures the program name, the full command line, and when it started. Event ID3 logs when a process opened a network connection. It captures the destination, the port, and which processes were responsible. Event ID 11 logs when a file was written to the disk. It captures the file name, the path, and which processes created it. What makes Sysmin so powerful for correlation is that it has a shared identifier that appears in all three event types. On screen, it is labeled process GUID. It's a unique value assigned to each process, and it follows that process across every event it generates. So if a process was created, and then that same process opened a connection to an outside host, and then wrote it to a file, and then the identifier ties all three events together, one chain, one process, from the moment it started to every action that it took, okay? So search the sysmin data for the suspicious host from scenario A. Can you find a process that explains the repeated outbound traffic? Can you find a connection event that matches the destination you saw in the packet capture? Can you find the file activity that happened before the upload in scenario C? Now, if the host event supports the network evidence, you have now correlated across four different sources: the packet capture, the CSV, the NDJSON, and the sysmin telemetry, which are all pointing in the same direction. That is a strong foundation for writing up your findings, and writing findings is its own skill, which is where we go next. Now, everything up until this point was about gathering, comparing evidence. Now the job changes. You have to explain what you found in a way that someone else can follow and evaluate. Use the format on the screen. Start with the finding. What do you think happened? Then the evidence. What exact host, ports, protocols, timing commands, or host clues support that? Then the reasoning. Why does that evidence point to this conclusion instead of something else? Then the action. What is the safe first response? And then finally, the next check. What would you want to verify before making a stronger claim? That last line is the most important. Beginners usually skip it, all right? But it is important. Every finding has limits. Packet evidence can show repeated connection to an outside host, but it can't prove malware is installed. Login evidence can confirm the same pattern across sources, but it can't tell you what was inside a transferred file. Sysmin can link a process to a connection, but it can't confirm intent without further analysis. Naming what you still do not know is not a weakness, okay? It's what separates careful analysis from just guessing. A good analyst does not just describe what happened, they explain how they know, and they're honest about where their evidence stops. So, write up one finding for each of the three scenarios using this format. Take your time with the wording, then we'll check your work. What you'll do is just compare your answers to the answer key, but focus less on whether you got the right label and more on how you got there. Did the theory you built from the packet capture actually hold up in the CSV? Did it survive? All of the other things that you had to compare it to. And when you wrote your findings, did you stay with what the evidence could actually prove, or did you start making claims that sounded confident but reached a little bit further than what the data supported? That self check is the real debrief. Labels are easy to memorize. Reasoning is the part that transfers to real work. An analyst who can explain their logic step by step is more valuable than one who can just name the attack but not show you how they reached that conclusion. If you want to go deeper, run the lab a second time without the guide. The first pass kind of teaches you the material. The second pass kind of tests your process. See where you can hold the thread from the packet capture through the logs, through the host evidence, and into the findings on your own. That repetition is where the skill actually sticks. Now, here is what this lab basically taught you, all this information, here underneath all the tools and file formats. You started with one raw evidence source and resisted the urge to jump to conclusions. You built a baseline, you filtered carefully, you formed 3 theories based on behavior, not assumptions. Then you tested each theory against a second source, and then a third, and then a fourth. And only after all that, you sat down and chose to write about it, all right? That progression is forensics correlation. It is the same process where the evidence comes from a practice lab or a live incident. The tools may change, the format may change, the scale even may change, but the logic will always stay the same. So compare, confirm, and be honest about what you still don't know. If you want the lab kit, the presentation, all the resources, again, they are linked in the description and in the comments below. And if you're ready to take it further, this is where Python can become useful. So once you start understanding the reasoning, you can start building tools that can help you do it faster. So hope you guys have a great time. See ya.